So now that we have order confirmation email set up, let's move this order mailer call to a background job. So instead of running it directly here in the webhook handler, we're going to run it in a background job so that the request is not blocked. And for doing that, we're going to use Active Job. Active Job is a framework provided by Rails for declaring jobs and making them run on a variety of queuing backends. Now, by default, Rails comes with a queuing implementation that can run jobs. Because it runs in the same process as Rails, it holds the jobs in memory. So the jobs will run, but when you restart the Rails server, any jobs that are still in the queue will be dropped. So it's not a very reliable way of running jobs. And this is why we use a dedicated queuing backend. In this lesson, we're going to use SolidQ as our backend. We'll look at that in a minute. First, let's start by creating our first job. Just like with mailers, Rails comes with very convenient generators for creating jobs. So back on the command line, we can run bin Rails generate job, and we'll call our job send order confirmation. Now let's open it up in our editor. And here you can see send order confirmation job. It inherits from application job. It says queue as default, so it will be in the default queue. You can define different queues based on different priorities. And then there's a method called perform. This is where you define what the job is going to do. And in our case, this is where we'll send the actual email. So let's update this method to send our confirmation email. So let's change this. Instead of args, we're going to just give it one argument, which is the order ID. And then let's get the code from the webhook controller. Let's copy that line and let's move that in here. And we just need to modify this. Instead of deliver later, we can change this to deliver now because this is going to run as a background job anyway. So at the time when the job actually runs, it's okay to deliver that email immediately. And that's what we would like to happen. And then back in the webhook controller, we can call the job. Instead of directly calling the mailer, we can say send order confirmation job dot perform later. This enqueues the job, and we just need to pass it the order ID, which is order.id. That's all the code we need for actually setting up the job. But what we do also need to do is choose our queuing backend. As I mentioned earlier, Rails Active Job can work with a number of queuing backends. Here's a list of some of the most popular ones. Sidekick is one of the most popular ones. And SolidQ is the latest addition to this list, which is now the default in Rails 8. And in this lesson, that's what we're going to use. So let's start by opening up our application.rb file and setting SolidQ as a default queuing adapter here. So we can say config.activejob.queueAdapter equals SolidQ. Since we're using Rails 7 here, we'll also need to install the SolidQ gem. So let's run bundle add SolidQ. And that installs the gem. And then let's run the SolidQ installer. So run Rails SolidQ install. And that generates a few configuration files for SolidQ. So there's queue.yaml, where you can define different queues for different environments. And there's a queue schema. So this is one new change that SolidQ has introduced. Typically, background jobs would be run in a different database like Redis. Redis is the standard. So Sidekick, for example, runs on Redis. But with SolidQ, you can use the same type of database that you're using for your application data. And typically that would be a SQL database. So either you're using SQLite or MySQL or Postgres, and you can use the same type of database also for storing your jobs. And by avoiding introducing another dependency like Redis, that helps reduce the running cost of your app and the complexity of your infrastructure. You may still separate the job data into a separate database, but of the same type. So even though you're using SQLite or Postgres, you can have a separate SQLite or separate Postgres database so that the jobs are stored in a different database and your main database isn't affected by that load. And if you look at environments production.rb, you'll also see that the same config line which we added to application.rb is here. So the default queue adapter is set to SolidQ, but here it's only meant for production. We set it in application so that it applies to all the environment. You can set it by environment. So you could set it a different one for development, for staging, for production. And here it also writes this line, config.solidq.connects to database writing queue. So it's saying connect to a separate database for writing the queue. Now, once you've done that, we'll then also have to add the configuration for the queue database in our config database.yaml file. So far, we only have our app database in there, but if we want to run the queue on a separate database, then we'll also need to add that to the database config file. Now, for our use case, we're going to keep things simple. And instead of creating a whole separate database for the jobs, we're just going to put the jobs in the same database as our application data. So instead of creating a whole separate database for the job queue, we're going to take this queue schema and run this as a separate migration so that it adds all these tables to our app database. So here back on the command line, we're going to generate that migration. We're going to say Rails generate migration, add solid queue tables. And then let's open up this migration. And in here, I'm going to copy and paste this code, which creates all the solid queue tables into that migration. And then we can get rid of that file. We don't need that. And let's run the migration. So Rails DB migrate. And then back in production.rb, let's also comment this line out because it's not connecting to a separate database for writing the queue. When we ran solid queue install, it also generated a bin/jobs file, which runs the job queue. We could run that separately, or we could add it to procfile.dev as another process so that everything runs with one command. When we run bin/dev, so in here, in addition to web and CSS, we'll add jobs and just run bin/jobs. Now we'll stop the Rails server and restart it with bin dev. And as you can see, there are 3 processes now. An additional one for jobs is running as well. Now let's test that in the browser by running through a purchase process. So I'm going to add a product to the cart and check out, make the payment. And once the payment is made, we can look at the Rails console to see that the solid queue job got enqueued. Now out of the box, it doesn't come with any kind of dashboard, so it's hard to keep track of jobs. So to make that easier, we're going to install another gem called Mission Control Jobs, which gives you a nice dashboard that you can look at in the browser and keep track of the status of your jobs. So let's first install this gem. So I'm going to run bundle add mission control jobs. And then we need to add this root where it mounts this engine in our apps. So let's go to our routes.rb config file, and right here at the bottom, we'll say mount mission control jobs engine at /jobs. Now we need to restart the Rails server. Then when you go to /jobs, you will see this dashboard, which shows our queue. We only have 1 at the moment, default, and there are no pending jobs. But on the Finish Jobs tab, you can see this one job that we just ran. You can see an argument of value 14, and that corresponds to the order ID of the last order we placed. So that's solid queue, really easy to set up and really easy to use.